together for over a year. With busy jobs, family duties, and many friends, they had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have some time alone. Finally, the chance came, and they were excited as they drove their rental car down the famous strip in Las Vegas, Nevada. "So, what do you want to do first?" Brent asked his wife of 7 years. He looked at her at a red light and smiled, happy to be with her. Even after all this time, he felt lucky to have such a beautiful woman as his wife. Joan, with her mixed Asian and Anglo heritage, had a soft and lovely face, and her dark hair framed her features nicely. She had a petite build that often caught people's attention, especially when they walked on the beach. But it was her smile that always made his heart flutter. Joan was thinking of the best way to answer Brent's question. She reflected on their relationship and remembered how handsome Brent appeared the first time she saw him. She was drawn to him because he treated her with respect, unlike other men who had made her feel like an object. He supported her in everything, always cheered her up when she was sad, and helped her break free from the protective shell built by her loving but controlling mother. Also, being 10 years older made her feel more comfortable around him, reminding her of her close bond with her father. Now, she was thinking about something that had been on her mind for nearly a year. Away from their daily routines, she wanted to explore something new and exciting. Wondering how to bring it up, she stayed quiet as Brent drove along the strip. When Joan didn't reply, Brent sensed something was on her mind. Curious, he asked, "You're being quiet. What are you thinking about? What are you thinking so hard about?" After a short pause, he joked, "It can't be that serious. We're on vacation." Joan smiled, realizing her husband knew her well. "Well, there are a few things on my mind. For one, I want to enjoy a really nice dinner with you. 2, I want to go shopping at the Forum shops in Caesar's Palace. And 3, when we get back to our hotel room tonight, I want you to be close with me so we can share a special moment together." Brent laughed as he heard her third wish. He loved it when she expressed herself so freely. Hearing her use such strong words always made him feel excited, and it certainly did then. He sensed she still had something more to say. Encouraging her, he asked, "And what's number 4? Joan bit her lip, a habit she had whenever she felt anxious or excited. After taking a careful breath, she cautiously replied, "Well, I've been hearing some of the girls at work talk about how much fun they have going to clubs with their husbands or friends. It got me curious, and I want you to take me to one so I can see for myself." Brent was taken aback by her response. Okay, I wasn't expecting that, he thought. Joan wasn't shy in their relationship, but he knew she had always been private about certain things. Despite being with him for years, he could see the influence of her upbringing was still strong. Over the last few years, though, she had opened up more about her feelings and desires, which had brought them closer. Nonetheless, he never imagined she would want to explore something like a club. She often hesitated to step into more daring places, even avoiding the adult section of the video store they visited. Sitting there, caught between disbelief and the idea that Joan actually wanted him to take her to a club, left Brent speechless. "Are you serious?" Brent's silence made Joan worry he might be upset. "What? No, not at all. I'm just very surprised, that's all," Brent exclaimed, taking a deep breath to calm his racing heart. Even after years of marriage, talking about anything related to intimacy with his wife still gave him a spark of excitement. But now, that feeling was much stronger. He took another deep breath, feeling as if butterflies were fluttering around in his stomach. "Did I upset you?" Joan wondered if she had said too much. "No, you didn't upset me at all," Brent said, gently squeezing her thigh to reassure her. Joan felt better after his touch. Before she could say more, Brent asked, "So, why are you curious about going to one of those clubs?" "Oh, it's just that a few times my friends have talked about it, and they always say how thrilling it is. They mention how much fun it is for them and their partners. I just want to see what it's really like inside," Joan said, feeling a tingle just thinking about it. She continued, "You've been to one. What did you think about it?" "Well, it was a long time ago. I think I was about 22. Wow, that was 16 years ago," Brent reminisced. "Did you enjoy it?" "I don't know. To be honest, I didn't find it that exciting because I knew I couldn't get close to anyone there, so I felt a bit silly being there. Plus, I was single then and didn't have a way to deal with my feelings that night." After a little pause, he added, but I see how some people could find it fun." After that, both Brent and Joan sat quietly, each lost in their thoughts. Brent was still trying to wrap his head around Joan's curiosity. It made him wonder what other things she might have heard from her friends, so he asked, "Now you've got me curious too. Have you thought about maybe dancing in one of those clubs, or are you just interested in seeing what it's like inside?" He couldn't help but think Joan had the looks that could catch anyone's attention. But as he suspected, Joan immediately replied, "No, no way. I would never dance in one. I'm just really curious, that's all. Plus, we're in Vegas. I won't worry about running into someone we know here." After a moment of disbelief, Brent said, "Okay, let's go. It'll be fun. And at least this time I know I'll be in for a good time afterward." Joan laughed, thrilled that he agreed. Still, she double-checked. "Are you sure you really want to go, though?" "Yeah, what's that saying? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." Joyfully, Joan replied, "I like that." She had heard that phrase before, and for her, by morning, it would mean so much more. A few hours later, after shopping, enjoying a nice dinner at the Bellagio, and having a couple of glasses of wine, Brent and Joan parked their car at a place called the Penthouse Club. As Brent paid the entrance fee, both felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Joan, especially, was eager to finally experience something she had been wanting to do for a long time. Once inside, Brent was pleasantly surprised by how nice it was. The place he remembered from years ago was not great, smelling of smoke and having less than attractive entertainers. But this club felt upscale with its great music, comfortable chairs, clean floors, and beautiful lighting, not to mention the amazing performers. Joan noticed the performers too. She had always thought of herself as straight and was drawn to men. She loved being close to Brent. But over the past couple of years, she had begun to feel curious about what it would be like to connect with another woman. It was just curiosity for her, but she found women's bodies quite beautiful. Seeing the performers now, dressed in revealing outfits and some completely undressed, stirred feelings in her that were new and exciting. With the snug red mini dress she chose for the evening, she felt a bit anxious, worried about how she was feeling. Just then, a hostess approached her and Brent. Joan felt more excitement when she noticed the hostess's outfit, which highlighted her figure in a captivating way. Joan held on to Brent's arm as they listened to the hostess explain how busy the club was that night. She mentioned that they might need to share their table with another couple later if necessary. Joan felt a bit uneasy at first, but when told they could sit closer to the stage if they didn't mind, she told Brent it was fine after he asked her. The hostess then led them to a table just a few feet from the large stage at the center of the club. As Brent followed Joan to their table, he couldn't help but admire how great she looked. He noticed a few people glancing at her as they walked, and it stirred up some thoughts in his mind. A little self-conscious, he hurried to sit down, hoping to calm himself. Once they were seated, the table was empty. After ordering drinks, they started looking around the club. Brent glanced to his right, watching a few dancers performing for a crowd. He noticed again that several people were still looking in Joan's direction, which made him feel a mix of pride and excitement. Joan, on the other hand, was focused on the stage. A young dancer, no older than 19, was performing an energetic routine, moving gracefully around a pole. Joan watched the dancer's skillful movements for a few minutes, feeling captivated by the performance. When the dancer's eyes briefly met hers, Joan felt her face grow warm in surprise, caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. The couple continued to watch the performance, each lost in their own thoughts, absorbing the atmosphere of the club. A few seconds later, Joan covered her mouth in surprise when the dancer playfully tapped her without hesitation, sparking a ring on the dancer's costume that shone brightly. Brent, fortunate enough to catch the last moments of the dance, admired how the dancer was playfully engaging with his wife. Noticing Joan's face was a bit flushed, he asked, "Are you okay?" Caught staring, Joan giggled and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine." "What do you think? Do you like it?" Brent asked, enjoying the rosy glow on Joan's cheeks. "I know we just got here, but I really like it. The girls at work were right. These places are exciting," she said, leaning into Brent and holding onto his arm. Brent smiled. "I thought your friend said these places were fun." Joan looked into his eyes and said, "Exciting is my word. Fun just doesn't say enough." Brent was surprised by her enthusiasm. especially since they had only just arrived, but he loved her reaction. For the next 30 minutes, they watched various dancers perform on stage, occasionally breaking away to enjoy a particular performer who later mingled in the crowd. They observed as one dancer engaged with a patron, who happily paid for an up-close experience. Eventually, Brent noticed the hostess who had shown them to their table approaching with another couple. As she came closer, Brent saw that the man looked to be in his early 50s and the woman in her late 30s. They both appeared very attractive, the man in a sharp suit and the woman in a stylish but modest dress. When the hostess reached their table, Brent stood, and they all introduced themselves. After exchanging some friendly words, everyone took a seat. Following a brief moment of silence, the older gentleman broke the ice, asking, "We haven't seen you both here before. Are you visiting Vegas from somewhere else?" "Yes, we are. We're from Los Angeles," Brent replied. With that, the couples began to chat, discussing their jobs, homes, and the usual small talk people share when getting to know one another. As time passed, Brent and Joan found themselves feeling comfortable around the new couple, quickly realizing they enjoyed their company. Brent and Joan enjoyed hearing about Stephen's job as a lawyer who fought against dishonest health companies, and Stacy's role as a manager at a well-known restaurant in a fancy hotel on the Strip. Stephen and Stacy, on the other hand, were interested in Brent's work as a television news producer and Joan's role as a clothing designer. As they talked, they were surprised to find that an hour and a half had passed. As the group continued to chat for another hour, everyone started to feel more comfortable with each other. This led to a more personal and open conversation. Encouraged by the relaxed atmosphere and a bit of wine, they shifted to more personal topics. They began with light-hearted questions about how each couple met and their first experiences with romance. Then Stacy surprised everyone by asking a deeper question. "So you two, how old were you when you had your first experience?" Brent felt that his wife might be shy about answering, so he quickly said, "It wasn't my choice, but I was 18. I think I was the only guy in my high school who didn't have that experience before graduation. I bet there's a plaque with my name on it at my old school because it seemed like everyone else was." Everyone laughed at this. "What was it like for you?" Stacy asked next. "It was fun. I was studying sports medicine in college, and at a convention in Albuquerque, I met someone a bit older than me. At first, she joked about me being a beginner, but that night things changed." Brent paused and added, "It was a great first experience." Stacy smiled. "You definitely seem to have enjoyed it." Joan usually wouldn't share such personal details, especially with people she had just met. But with a little encouragement from the atmosphere and feeling more open, she surprised herself by saying, "Brent was my first, the night we got married." After a moment, she added, "He's my first and only." Stephen quickly replied, "That's quite rare these days. It's really admirable and sweet." Joan smiled at Stephen's kind words. Sitting across from her at the table, Joan found him to be a very handsome man the moment she saw him. As the evening went on and she learned more about him, her feelings for him grew to the point where she felt a bit uneasy. From the conversation, she thought he was charming. His smile was warm, and his bright blue eyes were captivating. The fact that he was 20 years older than her only added to her interest. She caught herself occasionally staring at him, noticing his maturity, experience, and confidence, qualities she really liked in a man. When their eyes met after he complimented her, she felt slightly shy and said, "Thank you." Feeling encouraged by Joan's response, Stacy asked, "It's really sweet, but have you ever wondered what it would be like to be with another man?" Joan blushed and said quickly, "Oh, I think everyone is curious about that." As soon as she said it, she wished she could take it back. Brent turned his full attention to Joan, surprised by her answer. He remembered a time when they were watching a movie together, and he had asked her if she missed out on anything before they met. She had said no. Now he wondered if she had been honest. He found himself thinking about whether she truly was curious about being with someone else, and felt a rush of nerves. Joan, feeling a bit uneasy and wanting to change the subject, asked, "What about you two? How old were you when you first, you know?" Stephen, enjoying stories like that, jumped in excitedly. "Me? I was 14. Seeing the surprised looks from Brent and Joan, he added, "I know. I was young. Believe it or not, I was with my neighbor's wife while he was away." Joan noticed the smile on Stephen's face as he shared his story and said, "You seem to have happy memories of your first time, just like Brent." With a smile and looking into her eyes, Stephen replied simply, "I do." Brent noticed it right away. Even when they first met, it was clear that Stephen couldn't take his eyes off Joan, especially when they started discussing more personal topics. He didn't mind Stephen's attention on her at all. He was comfortable with it. Brent found himself more interested in Joan than he thought he would be. He noticed that his focus on her was growing stronger, unlike his attention toward others. Earlier, he had worried about what Stephen's wife, Stacy, might think. However, as he watched her, it seemed like she didn't mind at all. She was playfully engaging with him, which made him feel more at ease. The fact that neither Stephen nor Stacy showed any signs of jealousy was comforting. Joan also appeared relaxed, which was a relief to Brent. He wanted everyone to enjoy themselves, and they were. To keep the good times rolling, Brent turned to Stacy and asked, "How about you? How old were you when you first got serious with someone?" "I was the same age. I was 18. It happened during my first year in college," she replied with a laugh. Curious, Brent asked, "And what was it like? Was it special?" "Not really. My first time was with a guy who was quite different from me. I was so nervous I thought I wouldn't make it through. It was really tough and I felt sore for weeks." Everyone chuckled at her story. As Stacy spoke, Joan noticed how Stephen looked at his wife with warmth. He seemed to truly enjoy hearing her talk about her past. Surprisingly, Joan felt a sense of excitement at this. She wasn't sure why, but it caught her off guard. When Stacy finished her story, Joan found herself unexpectedly asking, "Well, I've only been with one man. How many partners have you had?" After a moment, she added, "If you don't mind me asking?" Stacy replied without hesitation, "Well, that depends on how you define intimate." Joan was taken aback and stuttered, She couldn't continue, feeling a bit embarrassed. Stephen came to her aid, saying, "I think she wants to know how many men you've been with, sweetheart." Stacy shot him a playful smile before turning back to Joan. Sensing that Joan might not want to hear everything, she simply said, "It's a few." Everyone understood that a few meant more than just a couple. Feeling increasingly curious, Joan took a sip of her drink and asked hesitantly, "Okay, now I really want to know. How many?" With a serious tone, Stacy gave Joan a look that said, "You asked, but don't judge me," before replying, "It's around 50 or so." Joan's jaw dropped in surprise at that number. She quickly glanced at Stephen, eager to see his reaction. She wasn't surprised to see him smiling as he gently touched his wife's back. Feeling uncertain, she couldn't believe she asked him, "And you? How many women have you been with?" Looking straight into Joan's eyes, Stephen replied, "I've had the pleasure of being with a few more." For a few seconds, no one spoke. When Joan asked her question, Stephen worried she wouldn't be able to handle the real number of women he had been with, especially since it was over 100. At first, Joan didn't really want to know, but as she thought about it more, curiosity crept in. She didn't understand why she felt this way. She just did. But in the end, she couldn't ask. Another awkward silence filled the table, and Stephen wanted to change that. He turned to Brent and said, "How about you? You're the last one?" Happy to get the conversation going again, Brent replied, "Well, Joan knows this. I was quite a playboy before I met her, but not as flashy as you two." He paused, wanting to make sure Richard and Stacy took it as a light compliment rather than an insult. Feeling confident they did, he continued, "I've been with 25, counting Joan, of course." Smiling and feeling curious about the number of partners Stephen and Stacy had, Joan teased Brent, "That's just the number of women you've been with. You've actually been with around 40. You don't count other things as being with someone either." Brent rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, well." Stephen jumped in. "Oh, if we're counting those other things, then my number is a lot lower." "Mine too," Stacy added. With those comments, everyone laughed again. After another round of drinks was served, Stephen asked, "So, what's the wildest place you two have been together?" Smiling, Joan surprised Brent when she quickly said, "On the beach in Maui. We walked along the beach at night, and when we were sure we were alone, we went to a spot with a lot of palm trees and enjoyed each other's company." She paused and added, "It was really exciting." Stacy chimed in, "Wasn't the sand a bit annoying, though?" "No. Joan felt a bit shy as she said, "We were standing when we did it." Stephen listened closely, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement as Joan shared a bit more about what happened on the beach that night in Maui. He thought she looked amazing, just like when he first saw her at the club earlier. Hearing her talk about a special moment from her past made him think about that image of her, and he couldn't help but feel a rush of warmth. Brent felt thrilled to hear his wife share such a personal moment in front of people they barely knew. He was surprised, but also delighted to see this new side of Joan. It made the evening even more enjoyable for him. Then he heard Joan ask, "How about you two? Where is the most exciting place you have been?" Stacy smiled and replied while looking at Stephen, making it clear that it was a cherished memory for both of them. "A few years ago, we went to a small old movie theater in San Francisco. There were a few people there. After watching the movie for a while, Stephen started teasing me and I couldn't help myself, so I got close to him right there." Listening to Stacy, Brent let out a soft sigh. Joan felt her cheeks warm up, a surge of energy rushing through her. She took a quick sip of her wine and, after thinking for a moment, she asked Stacy a question she already had in mind. "What was the most thrilling part for you?" "Being watched," Stacy replied with a grin. Curious, Joan asked, "What were the others in the theater doing when you were together?" Stacy smiled at the memory and said, "Most people were just watching us." Joan sighed softly, intrigued by the story. For the next 20 minutes, they continued discussing personal details. They asked each other questions about their favorite experiences and what made those moments special. As the conversation continued, Joan became aware of Stephen's growing attention toward her. Though she worried about how it might affect Stacy, her instincts told her that Stacy didn't feel threatened by what was turning into light flirtation between them. More importantly, Joan was concerned about how Brent, her husband, was taking it. She knew Brent well enough to understand that if he were uncomfortable, he would have politely suggested they leave. But so far, he hadn't shown any signs of being bothered by the situation. During the discussion, which had become more lively, Joan felt Stephen's leg brush against hers. Assuming it was accidental, she moved her leg a little to the side. A moment later, his leg pressed against hers again, this time more deliberately. Joan quickly realized it was intentional, and his boldness caught her by surprise. Before she could move away, she noticed Stephen giving her a look that left her breathless. Nervously, her heart raced as she glanced over at Brent and Stacy, who were deep in their own conversation and hadn't noticed anything unusual. When she looked back at Stephen, his expression made it clear that he knew she understood what he was doing. He then began to gently move his leg against hers again. Though the touch was light and subtle, it gave Joan a thrill she hadn't felt in a long time. The excitement was intensified by the fact that she allowed it to continue, all while sitting next to her husband. She knew she should stop it, but she couldn't bring herself to do so. Deep down, she realized she would feel a sense of disappointment if Stephen stopped on his own. Stephen, sensing her hesitation but not wanting to stop, continued his quiet gestures, occasionally adjusting his position but always returning to the same soft, deliberate movements against her leg. Once he playfully pulled up his pant leg and slid down his sock to lightly touch Joan's arm. He felt excitement surge through him when he noticed the goosebumps appear on her skin as he continued this playful contact under the table. Feeling thrilled that she was responding to him, he couldn't help but wish for something even bolder to happen. For now, though, he focused on her, wanting to understand how far she would let him go. He felt a strong curiosity but chose to enjoy the moments they shared instead. About 30 minutes later, after checking his watch and seeing it was midnight, Stephen decided it was time to suggest something new to their friends. With Stacy already aware of his plan, he said, "Well, we've had a great time talking with you two tonight. How would you feel about visiting a place that's even more interesting than this one? A place I think you haven't been to before." Brent and Joan exchanged curious looks. Cautiously, Brent asked, "What kind of place is it?" "There's a club we sometimes go to called simply The Club. It's, Stephen paused, uncertain if Brent and Joan would be open to the idea. He really didn't want to risk spoiling their enjoyable evening. Noticing Stephen's hesitation, Brent pressed for more details, asking, "And what kind of place is that?" "Well, it's a social club. Stephen finally shared, feeling his excitement push away any worry about their reaction. In surprise, Brent replied, "You mean, it's a place for couples to meet others?" Without missing a beat, Stephen glanced at Joan to see her reaction and answered, "Yeah, that's right." Before they could respond, he added, "Of course, you don't have to go if it makes you uncomfortable, but Stacy and I think it could be a fun experience for all of us." He quickly reassured them, saying, "We're not looking for anything too serious, just a good time. We've gone with couples who've never been to a swingers club before, and most of the time they don't do anything at all. There's no pressure to engage in anything you don't want to do. It's usually a really fun and interesting experience. We were wondering if you both would like to join us for the rest of the night and bring some extra fun and adventure to it." "I'm not sure," Brent said, speaking more for Joan than for himself. With all they had talked about that evening and the captivating woman dancing nearby, he found himself curious and eager to go. He just didn't expect Joan to want to join in, so he was giving her an easy way out. But she wasn't answering, which surprised him. What Brent didn't realize was that Stephen was quietly nudging Joan's leg, encouraging her to say yes. As she felt his touch, her heart raced, and she worried Brent might notice. She shared a cautious smile with her husband, but a part of her was unsure about taking the next step that night. Still, the excitement from the wine she had been sipping and Stephen's gentle urging made her ask Stacy, "What's this place really like?" With a smile, Stacy replied, "It's really nice. Everyone is laid back and you'll meet some of the friendliest people there. There are a few security guys around, but I've never seen any trouble. The place is pretty big. There's a bar and a dance floor downstairs and a hot tub area. Upstairs is where things get a little more adventurous. Overall, it's a fun and safe place to be. I really enjoy going there." After Stacy spoke, the group went quiet. Joan felt everyone's eyes on her again. Brent smiled encouragingly, and she realized he wanted to go. After a few moments of thought, she told herself to go for it. You only live once, and she was away from home. Who would know? Taking a nervous breath and glancing at Brent for reassurance, she finally said, "Okay, if you promise I'll be safe, then I'll go. You two have me really curious now. So, I'll go." Just as Joan finished speaking, she felt a wave of excitement rush through her. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. Seeing Joan shiver slightly, Stacy smiled and said softly as they walked out of the club with their husbands, "You'll be okay, Joan. Our husbands will take care of us." After a moment, Stacy added playfully, "But stay close to one of them because I bet there are going to be a lot of people at the place we're going who will notice how you look tonight." Joan felt another wave of excitement at Stacy's words, even stronger than before. Once outside, Brent pulled out his keys and asked Stephen, "Is this place far? Should we get directions or just follow you?" Stephen shook his head and replied, "Why don't you come with us? The place is a bit hidden and could be hard to find. Is that okay?" Brent checked with Joan to make sure she was comfortable, then said, "Sure." A few minutes later, Brent and Joan were enjoying the soft leather seats in Stephen's car as he smoothly merged onto the freeway. Brent pushed away his envy of the nice car and playfully asked their new friends, "With how many people you two have been with, I'm guessing you've had some good times at the place we're heading to." Stephen laughed and said, "That's a fair guess." Feeling more confident, Brent asked, "Do both of you date other people now?" In unison, Stephen and Stacy replied, "Yeah, we do." After a moment, Stacy turned slightly to look at Brent and Joan, asking, "We hope that doesn't make you uncomfortable?" Brent was not uncomfortable at all. In fact, he felt quite the opposite. It was exciting for him. For Joan, it was a bit uncomfortable. But with how she felt now, it was only a little. She found herself needing to ask, "Does it ever bother you that the other is seeing someone else?" Stacy smiled and said, "I love Stephen completely, and I know he feels the same way about me." As she spoke, Joan noticed Stephen gently placing his hand on his wife's leg. Stacy continued, "We've always been very passionate, but over time we started feeling a bit bored, just like many couples do. After some exploration, we discovered this lifestyle and found it to be very exciting. To answer your question, does it bother us? No. For me, I see it as just casual, enjoyable fun, not something deeper. I also enjoy seeing him happy with someone else. It makes me feel good knowing he's having a good time." As Joan listened to Stacy and Stephen talk about swinging, she noticed that she was feeling more and more intrigued. However, she also felt uneasy about these feelings. From how she was raised, her conscience told her that what they were doing was wrong. But still, she felt increasingly curious as she heard more about their experiences. Sitting quietly in the back seat of the car, she couldn't help but think, why are you doing this? Why did you let Steven touch you? Why are you so interested in all of this? And as she thought more about where they were going, she nervously bit her lip, wondering what the night would hold for her. Then, trying to focus on Steven and Stacy, Joan asked, "Do you ever feel jealous?" Stacy smiled and said, "Sometimes, but not in the usual way. I only feel a little jealous if Steven has more fun than I do." After a moment, Steven looked at them in the mirror and asked, "Have you two ever thought about being with other people?" Both Brent and Joan paused, but then Brent turned to Joan and said, "After we've watched a movie, I've mentioned things like that lightly. I'm not sure I could actually see you doing something like that in real life, though." He said this thinking it would make Joan feel good, but it wasn't entirely true. Joan smiled at that, but before she could respond, Steven asked her directly, "What about you, Joan? Earlier you seemed curious about being with someone else. Do you think you could ever do that?" Joan quickly replied, "No, I don't think I could ever be unfaithful to Brent. I don't know how I would feel about myself." "What if he knew what you were doing? Would that change things?" Joan felt a shiver at the thought. Goosebumps rose on her skin and she responded, "I don't know. That's a serious question." Before anyone could ask more of her, and she was grateful for that because it felt like all eyes were on her. Joan noticed Stacy pointing to a sign and saying, "We're almost there." Less than a minute later, Steven drove his car into a parking lot, needing to navigate to the back of a large building to find a spot. As he searched for a place to park, Brent was surprised by the number of cars. He never thought there would be this many people in a city like this. But then again, they were in Sin City. Most of the people here were probably just visitors, he thought to himself. For Joan, seeing the crowded parking lot made her feel both nervous and somewhat safe. There was safety in numbers, but after what Stacy had quietly told her in the club earlier, she couldn't shake the worry that someone might try to approach her wrongly. Taking a deep breath after Steven parked the car, she grabbed Brent's hand as she got out, quickly realizing how much she was shaking inside from all her nervous energy. As they walked toward the club, Joan reflected on how she started the night wanting just a little excitement by visiting a club. However, now, everything was so much more than she had planned or expected. Despite her nerves, she felt a thrilling excitement that was much stronger than she had anticipated. With each step toward the entrance of the club, her anticipation grew, making her wonder what she would see next. When she entered the club, Joan found that Stacy's description was spot on. The place was not threatening or uninviting like she had worried it might be. However, as her gaze moved around the lower level of the club, she soon noticed two women affectionately interacting with each other. The sight of them openly sharing such a moment in front of many people made her slow her pace. A few seconds later, Joan felt a mix of curiosity and hesitation. She glanced away from a couple near her, worried it looked like she was staring. Instead, her eyes landed on another woman who was standing close to a man. The woman seemed to be enjoying whatever attention he was giving her. Moments later, Joan froze when she noticed a young man walking by. He seemed to be wearing only a towel around his waist, which made her feel uneasy. It became clear to her that he was behaving in a way she found shocking. When he looked at her and smiled while moving under the towel, Joan quickly blushed and moved closer to Brent, holding his arm as if seeking comfort. Noticing her reaction, Steven asked, "Joan, if you're uncomfortable, we can leave right now if you want to." Joan appreciated his concern and replied, "No, I'm okay. It's just unexpected, that's all." To prepare Joan for what might come next, Steven continued, "Just so you know, what you're seeing now is pretty mild compared to what you might see upstairs." "Are you sure?" "Yeah. It's not like I've never seen people naked before. I've watched a few movies like that. I'll be fine," Joan said confidently. Steven and Stacy exchanged quick giggles, knowing that seeing something in real life was very different from what was shown in movies. They were both eager to see Joan's reaction when she arrived at the next level of experiences. Excited, Steven said, "Okay, if you're ready, let's head upstairs." Feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation, Joan replied, "Let's go." Joining closely behind Stephen and Stacy, Brent and Joan climbed a spiral staircase to the second floor. After navigating through some hallways, they found themselves facing a big crowd. Almost everyone was looking through a glass wall. As they approached, they were captivated by what was happening on the other side of the glass. Inside the room were about 30 people, all engaged in various intimate activities. In one corner, Brent watched with interest as a man leaned in to kiss a lovely blonde woman. She sat with her legs apart, looking down at him while he gently rubbed one of her feet on his back. A little later, he noticed a couple nearby. The woman was sitting on top of a man who was lying back and smiling. He held her waist while she looked over at another man standing beside them. Joan, feeling a bit dizzy, was also captivated. Her gaze was fixed on a couple just a few feet away. She bit her lip as her heart raced, entranced by the way a young man was moving closely with a young woman. It was the first time she had seen such a scene up close, and the excitement was overwhelming. Soon she watched as another woman approached the man they were focused on, kissing him deeply, their movements lively as they enjoyed each other's presence. Her heart skipped when the woman broke away to kiss another woman who was with the man. Joan sighed as she saw the two women playfully share their kisses, their movements making the atmosphere more exciting. As Brent and Joan continued to watch, Stephen and Stacy enjoyed seeing their reactions. It was clear that excitement was building for the couple, shown by how they shifted nervously. However, after about 20 minutes, Stacy decided she needed a break. She whispered to Stephen, and then stepped over to kiss Brent and Joan lightly on the cheek. "I've really enjoyed this night with both of you, but there's somewhere I need to go. I'll catch up with you later," she said before leaving the hallway with Stephen. Brent turned to Stephen and asked, "Is she all right?" "Oh yes, she's just fine. You'll see her again really soon." About 10 minutes later, they did. From the back of the room where people were gathered, Brent and Joan were surprised when they saw Stacy enter. She was wearing a silk robe and walked slowly toward them. When she stopped and smiled, they were taken aback as she casually let the robe fall away, standing completely bare before them. Joan quickly turned to Stephen, eager to see his reaction. She noticed the proud look on his face and the loving wink he gave her, just as she expected. Feeling a rush of unexpected emotions, Joan turned back to Stacy, her heart racing as she watched her interacting with a man who approached her. Stacy seemed to be encouraging him as they chatted. For Brent, the moment he saw Stacy drop the robe, he was captivated. He couldn't help but admire her flawless appearance. When she glanced at him and licked her lips, it felt like she was inviting him. But with Joan beside him, he fought the urge to give in to temptation as he watched her with the man nearby. As Joan continued to watch Stacy, she became more and more focused on what was happening. She was astonished to see Stacy engaging with the man, completely immersed in the moment. It surprised her to realize that a woman she had just met was sharing such an experience with someone she didn't know. With her thoughts racing, Joan turned to Stephen and asked, "Doesn't this bother you, watching your wife with another man right now?" "Not at all. Like she said to you in the car, we've been doing this for years. Not all the time." Joan listened intently as Stephen spoke. "Sometimes when we get bored, honestly, I really enjoy watching her with others. I don't know why, but it excites me." As he finished, Joan noticed the admiration he still held for Stacy, his eyes focused on the room beyond her. Turning her attention back to Stacy, Joan watched as she reached for something from her robe on the floor. She saw Stacy take a moment before moving closer to the man beside her, and Joan could feel the intensity in the room rising. The two moved together, sharing a moment that drew the focus of everyone nearby. Brent and Joan watched in silence as the connection between Stacy and the man deepened, each movement drawing the couple closer together. Stacy's confidence was clear, and her occasional glances toward the group showed she was fully aware of her surroundings, but still immersed in her experience. As time passed, the man beside Stacy became visibly more focused, his movements quickening. It wasn't long before he tensed up, his body responding to the intensity of the moment. Stacy smiled softly, her hands gently brushing his back, showing a quiet acceptance of what had happened. When it was over, she gave him a gentle kiss, a tender end to the shared experience. For Joan, the scene left a lingering impression. There was something about witnessing such an intimate moment that stirred unfamiliar feelings inside her. The atmosphere in the room remained charged, and it wasn't long before Stacy found herself drawn to another companion, ready to continue the evening. The room was still alive with energy, and Joan found herself lost in thought, her emotions swirling as she observed everything around her. Before Joan and Brent had a chance to fully take in the situation, Joan found herself seated in a chair, feeling overwhelmed by the new environment. As she tried to process everything happening around her, Brent watched her closely, noticing how absorbed she was in the moment. Seeing the intensity of the situation, Stephen soon suggested, "Would you two like to explore the rest of the club?" Without hesitation, Brent responded, "Not really. I'd actually like to keep watching Stacy." Joan was surprised by her husband's response, but even more surprised by her own reaction. Normally, she would have questioned him, but she felt an unexpected sense of calm. She trusted Brent, even in a place like this, and believed he had always been loyal to her. Still, a small part of her wondered if she should trust herself in such a setting. She knew how easily emotions could cloud judgment, much like alcohol. Despite these thoughts, Joan shocked herself by saying, "I do, though. I want to see what else is around here." Brent, still taken aback by how things had unfolded that night, didn't expect Joan to suggest this. He trusted her as much as she trusted him, but with everything happening around them, his curiosity and long-held fantasies were surfacing. He wanted to keep watching Stacy, but also wanted to see how far Joan was willing to step outside her comfort zone. Shaking with excitement, he found himself saying, "It's up to you. I trust you. Go ahead and explore if you want, as long as you don't mind if I stay here." Joan could tell from Brent's expression that he wasn't trying to test her. He genuinely wanted her to explore, and the thought excited her. As she realized what she was about to do, a nervous but thrilling feeling ran through her. Sensing the moment and not wanting her to change her mind, Stephen added, "Brent, don't worry. I'll keep an eye on her. I promise I'll behave." Brent smiled and nodded at Stephen's words, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Looking back at Joan, he leaned down and gave her a quick kiss on the lips. He said, "Have fun, but don't get anyone in trouble." Just before she walked away, he leaned in and whispered, "And remember, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." When Joan heard this, her eyes widened. Looking at Brent's face, she noticed a look she had never seen from him before. Smiling, she replied, "Okay," then turned to walk with Stephen down the hallway. As she walked, she suddenly realized where she had seen that look. It was the same look Stephen had when he glanced at Stacy when the talk was about intimate topics. This thought made her heart race a bit. Brent wondered if he should have kept his mouth shut before saying what he did. He watched as Stephen and Joan walked down the hallway until they turned a corner. Once they were gone, he focused entirely on Stacy, feeling surprised by the scene unfolding before him. Walking with Joan, Stephen felt lucky. He never thought he would end up alone with her tonight. His heart was racing, so he said, "I have to say, I'm surprised and happy that Brent let you go off alone with me." Joan replied with a nervous smile, "Me too." Then she joked, "That doesn't mean you're going to hurt me now, does it?" Stephen smiled back, "No way, not at all." After a moment of silence, he asked, "Is there any place around here you want to see?" Feeling a mix of excitement and nerves, Joan quickly said, "I don't know. What else can we check out?" Noticing her caution, Stephen tried to reassure her. "Well, there's a room for couples, or there's a space for women who want to meet other women. We could look at that too. And there's another place nearby for someone wanting to be the center of attention, if you're interested in that." As he shared these options with her, they reached a door marked Couples Only. Joan pointed and asked, "What's this room?" "That's for couples wanting to spend time with other couples just for them," Stephen explained. Joan looked at Stephen with interest. "Can we go in there?" she asked. "Sure, but there's a rule. You have to be doing something special with your partner in there. Plus, you need to be at least a little bit undressed." "Oh." Joan paused, not moving. Stephen watched her carefully. He noticed she could hear soft noises coming from the room. Curiously, she asked, "What does partially naked mean?" Feeling a bit shy, he answered, A bra and undergarments would be okay, but less clothing would be even better." Stephen sensed Joan was thinking about whether to go in or not. He felt a bit sad when she started to walk further down the hallway. He took a deep breath to relax, and they turned a corner, moving to another crowd. Before she could ask, he said, "This is the place I told you about. Here, women can be the focus of attention. The rule here is that a woman has to be close with at least 2 other people. The more the better." Joan was surprised to hear this. She had seen similar things in movies, but couldn't believe it was real. She thought it was strange that women would be open to this without expecting something in return. Still, her curiosity grew, and she decided to move through the crowd of men who were watching her closely. When she reached the front, she gasped and covered her mouth with her fingers at the sight inside the room. There, 2 women were surrounded by several men, allowing them to interact freely. Joan's wide eyes quickly turned to focus on a woman nearby. Joan glanced over and noticed a woman, older and more curvy than herself, lying on her back. 2 men, one black and one white, were close to her, each focused on her. Joan's eyes followed the scene, taking in the way another man was sitting between the woman's legs, carefully attending to her with focused attention. The intensity of the moment was clear, and Joan felt a wave of mixed emotions as she continued watching. A few minutes later, Joan noticed things escalating further for the woman. As Joan watched, the woman shifted her position, and Joan felt a strange sensation as she realized what was happening. The woman's boldness left her both amazed and unsettled. Joan's thoughts raced as she observed the scene, trying to make sense of the complex emotions swirling within her. For the next several minutes, Joan watched in a daze, her heart pounding. The energy in the room was overwhelming, and she found herself drawn into the spectacle, feeling a sense of confusion mixed with fascination. Though everything around her was intense, Joan's mind drifted as she processed the experience. She could feel the tension in her body, unsure how to react to the surreal scene unfolding before her. The atmosphere was charged, but Joan remained quiet, reflecting on what she had seen and felt throughout the night. Joan watched as the men engaged in different activities, while the women moved from one man to another. She sighed when she noticed the excitement, feeling a mix of emotions as she observed what was happening. Stephen was beside her, and she felt a tingle when he placed his hands on her shoulders and gently glided his fingers along her arms. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, especially when he began to softly caress the back of her neck. Lost in the scene in front of her and Stephen's gentle touch, she barely noticed when she turned her head slightly, feeling a flutter when he leaned closer to her ear. He asked quietly, "Is there a part of you wishing to join in, Joan?" But as she felt him press closer, her instincts kicked in, and she quickly stepped away. "We need to stop. Brent might see us. We should go," she said. Stephen was taken aback, realizing he had crossed a line. As they turned a corner out of sight of the crowd, he apologized. "I'm sorry. I guess I got carried away." Joan smiled, still feeling the warmth from their moment. "That's okay. I was feeling a bit overwhelmed too." She could see he was truly sorry for his previous actions. Reflecting on their connection that night, she felt flattered and noticed that he made her feel attractive. Encouraged by this feeling, they reached a fork in the hallway. Joan spotted another passage about 30 feet long with 3 doors on each side. Curious, she asked, "What's down this way?" With a smile, remembering the purpose of that section, he replied, "These are private rooms, places where couples or groups can enjoy some privacy." Without looking back, Joan walked down the hallway and stopped at the first door. She heard a woman's loud moans from inside, suggesting she was clearly enjoying herself. Playfully biting her lip, Joan grinned at Stephen before continuing down the hall, eventually stopping at an empty room. Walking inside, she immediately felt a playful spirit, wanting to get back at Stephen by teasing him like he had done earlier. She noticed a bed with steps that looked like seating for an audience. She took off her shoes and jumped on the bed, bouncing a few times while Stephen looked on. At one point, feeling bold, she moved her body in a way she had seen from dancers not long before. But feeling a bit shy, she settled on the soft mattress and asked Stephen, "So, have you ever been with anyone in here?" Smiling at Joan's playful side, Stephen replied, "Yes, I've been with someone here before." "Was it anyone other than your wife?" Joan asked, surprised at her own boldness. Enjoying their playful exchange, Stephen answered, "A few." "How many?" Joan inquired. "I'm not sure, maybe 5 or 6. Curious, Joan asked, "What was the craziest thing you did here?" "Definitely this one time when my friends and I had quite a wild party here." He began to share a story from a year ago about a fun time he had with a young woman. As he talked about the memorable night, he watched Joan closely, hoping she was intrigued by his story too. She was curious but felt a bit nervous as well. When Stephen finished his story, there was a moment of silence as they exchanged glances. Then Stephen said, "You know what? I think you're teasing me, Joan, and it's making me feel a certain way." He then reached down, making it clear he was feeling something. Instantly, Joan felt a rush of excitement, and her heart started racing. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she curled her toes into the carpet, focusing on him. She sighed as he simply said, "See?" As Stephen watched her, he noticed a mix of emotions on Joan's face, a bit of fear, nervousness, and excitement, which made her look even more captivating. Pushing things a little further, he softly asked, "So tell me, are you as excited as I am?" Hearing this, Joan took a deep breath, hoping he didn't notice how much she was trembling. Joan sighed quietly when Stephen spoke again, asking softly, "Are you as excited as I am?" Not responding right away, Joan was startled out of her thoughts when she saw Stephen move to close the door. Realizing the situation, she quickly grabbed her shoes and started walking toward the exit. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to lead you on." Stephen, feeling bold, gently placed a hand on her stomach as she tried to pass him. "It's okay," he reassured her. "But before you go, can you answer my question? Are you as interested as I am?" His voice and touch made Joan feel nervous and unsure. She stood still, unable to move, listening to their breathing. After a few moments of silence, Stephen leaned closer and whispered the question again, "Are you?" Trembling and feeling overwhelmed, Joan finally whispered, "Yes." Stephen, encouraged by her answer, pressed further, asking in a low voice, "Are you really as excited as I am?" Barely able to speak, Joan softly replied, "Yes." Stephen sighed in response, sensing the intensity of the moment. They stood close to each other, both feeling the tension but unable to meet each other's gaze. Stephen gently ran his fingers across her stomach, lightly brushing her sides. Without thinking clearly, he asked, "I saw how you looked at me earlier. Have you ever touched another man besides your husband?" Joan hesitated, feeling even more nervous. "No," she replied shyly. Stephen let out another sigh and asked, "Have you ever wanted to?" Feeling lightheaded, Joan whispered, "Sometimes." "How about now?" Stephen asked. Joan swallowed hard, pausing for a moment before softly answering, "Yes." Stephen's excitement grew as he asked, "Would you want this to be your moment? Would you like to experience this now?" Joan felt a wave of emotion rush through her, causing her to shiver. Despite the pull she felt, she responded defensively, "I shouldn't. I'm married. We're both married." Stephen, not backing down, replied, "What my wife is doing right now doesn't bother me, and your husband is probably watching her. It's not a problem for me. I'd love to be the second man in your life, Joan." Stephen could sense that Joan wasn't going to leave on her own. Taking a risk, he gently reached for her hand and guided it toward himself, placing it against him. Joan didn't resist, and he moved her hand along slowly. After a minute or two, Stephen released her hand, pleased to see her continue the movement on her own, her actions becoming more assured. He could feel the tension in the air as Joan focused on what she was doing, her touch growing more confident with time. Joan, even as she stood there, couldn't fully grasp what she was doing. She was caught between disbelief and the strange reality of the situation. It all felt surreal, yet she knew it was happening. Her thoughts raced as Stephen began loosening his belt, then unfastened a button before slowly pulling down the zipper. The air in the room felt heavier when he softly asked, "Do you want to see it?" This was Joan's last chance to stop, but she found she couldn't. She hesitated, trying to convince herself that this wasn't really crossing a line, that it was only a brief moment. After a few seconds, she nodded, unable to meet Stephen's eyes. Her heart raced as she watched him lower his slacks to the floor. Stephen was eager, wanting to see Joan's reaction, and quickly moved to reveal himself, anticipating her response. Joan's breath caught in her throat as she glanced down, her mind clouded with nervous anticipation. When she saw him, a shiver ran through her, but she was also struck by how different Stephen was from her husband, Brent. She knew her husband was average in size, but seeing Stephen now, the comparison stood out in her mind. The moment was surreal, and her thoughts swirled as she processed the unexpected turn of events. Joan couldn't tear her eyes away from Stephen, feeling a mix of surprise and uncertainty. Though slightly intimidated, she also felt a strong curiosity to understand more of what she was seeing. Sensing her interest, Stephen gently encouraged her. "It's okay, you can touch it." Though she didn't need the prompt, the words made her even more focused. Hesitantly, Joan reached out, feeling both nervous and intrigued as she touched him. The sensation was different from what she expected, and her hand trembled slightly as she carefully explored, tracing her fingers slowly along his skin. She noticed every detail, feeling a strange sense of fascination as her mind processed the moment. Stephen enjoyed her touch but wanted to shift his attention to her, wanting to make sure she felt just as at ease. For now, though, he chose to remain patient. He quickly unbuttoned his shirt and let it fall away, then removed his shoes and socks, trying to seem relaxed. When Joan took a cautious step back, Stephen reassured her, "It's all right. I like that you're seeing me as I am. It's part of who I am." Seeing she wasn't going to run away, Stephen leaned against the wall, giving her space to continue. Joan hesitated for a moment before stepping closer again, her expression still unsure but calm. Slowly, she let her sandals drop from her hand and placed it gently on Stephen's side, her touch light but curious. For several minutes the two stayed like this, Joan quietly exploring while Stephen focused on staying calm, trying not to rush the moment. But after a while, the tension grew too strong. Unable to hold back any longer, Stephen gently grabbed Joan by her upper arms and turned her toward the wall behind them, shifting the energy between them without crossing any further lines. Stephen gently placed his hands on Joan's shoulders, letting his touch move slowly to the nape of her neck. His gaze was intense, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "I really want to be close to you. I want to see all of you, to know how beautiful you are." Joan, surprised by his sudden boldness, instinctively put one hand on his arm and the other on his chest, trying to create some distance. But as she looked into Stephen's eyes and heard the emotion in his voice, the nervousness she initially felt started to fade. Despite feeling a strong pull, she whispered, "I don't know, I shouldn't," her thoughts briefly turning to her husband. Stephen sensed her hesitation, but his emotions were running high. Driven by the moment, he gently touched her again, his hands moving over her shoulders. He could feel her tension ease slightly, and her eyes closed as she let out a quiet sigh. Her initial resistance seemed to waver. Stephen moved his hand carefully up to her neck again, noticing the way she responded to his touch. He saw this as a sign to take another small step, so he slowly slipped a finger under one of her dress straps and eased it down her arm. When she didn't pull away, he did the same on the other side, his actions deliberate and slow. Joan stood there, trembling, her eyes still closed. She breathed steadily, caught in the moment as Stephen paused, watching her closely, unsure of what would happen next, but mindful of the delicate tension between them. Stephen, encouraged by Joan's subtle responses, gently ran his hands down her sides. He carefully gripped her dress just below her chest and slowly pulled it down to her hips, revealing the lacy fabric beneath. To his surprise, Joan moved her arms, helping him by slipping out of the dress straps, signaling her acceptance of the moment. His face flushed as he focused on Joan's expression, noticing how she appeared to grow more relaxed and comfortable, though still nervous. Feeling emboldened, Stephen made another careful move, his hands trembling slightly as he gently pulled the dress further down her body. He knelt as he lowered it to her ankles, and Joan, after a brief hesitation, stepped out of the dress, leaving her standing there in her undergarments. Joan felt lightheaded, barely able to process what was happening. The situation felt surreal as she watched Stephen kneeling before her, but at the same time, there was a sense of nervous excitement. Despite being unsure, there was something about the way Stephen looked at her, his gaze filled with admiration, that made her feel empowered and desirable in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. For the next few moments, Stephen quietly admired her, gently running his hands along her arms and back, both of them lost in the intensity of the moment. Stephen began by lightly running his hands along Joan's legs, starting at her calves and gradually moving up, carefully avoiding anything too intimate as he traced the curves of her hips. Standing as he moved higher, his fingertips gently glided over her stomach, pausing for a moment to admire her navel piercing. He continued, slowly brushing his hands over her chest and then up to her neck and shoulders, his touch gentle. "Can I see more?" he asked softly, his voice filled with admiration. "Can I see more of your beautiful self?" Joan sighed, feeling conflicted despite the intensity of the moment. Her thoughts turned to her husband and she struggled with the feelings inside her. "I don't know," she replied, her voice uncertain. "I've never done anything like this before. I can't believe I'm letting this happen." Stephen, filled with excitement but sensing her hesitation, responded after a pause. "Earlier, Brent said something about certain things not really counting. What do you think?" He knew the question was bold, but he pressed on, gently tracing a finger up and down her chest. Joan inhaled sharply, both alarmed by Stephen's words and affected by the subtle touch. She hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I think that's a silly idea. But then again, I'm not sure. Sometimes I see his point." Stephen, sensing an opportunity, asked carefully, "And what are you thinking right now?" He moved his hand slightly, briefly brushing against her, and watched as Joan responded with a soft wince of surprise. Joan sighed again, trying to steady herself. "I don't know," she whispered, the confusion in her voice matching the whirlwind of emotions inside her. A part of her realized that her inner struggle was making everything more intense. Seeing the uncertainty in her expression, Stephen decided not to push her further. Wanting to keep things light but still intriguing, he asked, "Do you think two people watching each other just watching, would that be crossing a line?" Joan breathed deeply, contemplating his question. After a few moments, she quietly answered, "No. I'm not so sure." After thinking about her reply, she quickly added, "But I'm not sure I could do something like that. That feels too private." Taking this chance, Stephen asked, "Would it make you uncomfortable if I touched myself while I looked at you?" The moment Joan heard Stephen's words, she realized how much she was shaking again. Thinking about his question, she imagined it would be quite an unusual thing to see. The idea of him admiring her made her feel special. So she whispered, "No." With a smile, Stephen pushed further, asking, "Would it make you uncomfortable if I looked at you while you were completely bare?" As she processed this, Joan sighed softly. A chill ran through her as she considered it. Finally, she replied, "I don't know." After a pause, she felt unsure and carefully asked, "If I did, would you promise to be considerate?" Expecting a refusal, Stephen felt a twinge of hope in her response and immediately said, "I promise. I won't do anything you don't want." Joan sighed heavily, unable to say anything else. In that moment, Stephen realized he could do more. He knew he needed to act quickly to prevent Joan from changing her mind. As she stood quietly, he gently started tracing his fingers around her sides and back, trying to draw her in further. As his excitement grew, his hands began to linger more, paying attention to her reactions. He noticed she closed her eyes and let out soft sounds, showing that she was feeling something. As their connection deepened, Stephen felt it was time to take a step further. He moved his hands around her and suddenly unclasped an item of her clothing, marveling at the sight before him. His heart raced as he said to her sincerely, "You are truly amazing, Joan. Simply breathtaking." Joan felt a rush of warmth from Stephen's compliment and the cool air brushing against her skin. A moment later, she let out a soft sound when Stephen touched her, causing her to want more of his attention. For Stephen, seeing how Joan reacted to his gentle touch made him feel excited as he admired her. He enjoyed how nicely they fit together and how her body responded to him. As he continued to explore, he felt a strong desire to see more of her. Without asking, he slowly knelt down in front of her. Looking up at her, he noticed her relaxed gaze and reached out to touch her legs, moving his hands gently. After a moment, he paused when he felt ready to go further, trying to manage his nervousness. Feeling a mix of courage and anticipation, he carefully lowered her clothing. When he saw her standing there, completely bare, he could hardly believe it. Joan felt a rush of emotions, battling between thoughts of stopping and the way Stephen looked at her with his bright blue eyes. As he continued to touch her gently, she remembered his earlier request. She found herself willing to share this moment with him, but deep down, she recognized a shift inside her. Despite the stirrings within, she knew she needed to keep her mind strong. It was a challenge. Stephen, with great care, continued to touch her and then leaned in to place a soft kiss on her neck. Stephen pulled back slightly, noticing Joan wasn't resisting, and without warning, he leaned in and placed his lips gently over her shoulder, causing her to gasp in surprise. His movements were slow and measured, and he held her lightly at her waist, carefully guiding the moment. After a brief pause, Stephen stood up again, seeing the mixed emotions on Joan's face. With a soft smile, he said, "I'm sorry if that was too much. I just couldn't help myself." Breathless, Joan managed to respond, "It's okay." Stephen, encouraged by her response, asked quietly, "Would you like me to continue?" Joan sighed deeply, processing the intensity of the situation. Though she felt drawn in, she fought to maintain her composure. "I don't know. I think that might be too much," she finally replied, a hint of apology in her voice. "I'm sorry." Stephen nodded understandingly. "It's okay. Don't apologize," he reassured her gently. "But look, you've clearly made an impression." Joan glanced down, feeling another surge of emotion but trying to maintain control. After a pause, she said softly, "I don't think I can continue, but I don't mind if you want to finish. It wouldn't be fair otherwise." Stephen felt a wave of surprise but asked carefully, "Are you sure?" Joan smiled a little, still feeling unsure but curious. "Yes. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think it would be okay." Stephen, feeling the tension rise, smiled back. "It's exciting to hear you say that, but I'll warn you, when I'm this worked up, it can be a lot." Joan laughed lightly, feeling the tension lift slightly. "That's okay. There are towels nearby," she replied with a playful grin. Stephen, his hands trembling slightly, nodded. He began to focus, still trying to stay grounded in the moment as he steadied himself. The atmosphere remained charged, but it was clear both were careful with the situation, respecting the boundaries that had been quietly set. After a few moments, as Stephen's gaze moved up and down Joan's body, he hesitantly asked, "Would it be okay if I touched you while I'm doing this?" Surprised by how much more drawn in she was than she expected, Joan asked cautiously, "Where?" Taking a chance, Stephen responded, "Everywhere?" Joan, still trying to hold on to her boundaries, replied, "I don't know." After a brief pause, she added, "I don't think I can let you touch me there, but you can touch me anywhere else." "Okay," Stephen said, feeling a slight disappointment but still hopeful. He stepped closer, standing just a foot away from her. As he continued, his left hand gently brushed her skin while his right hand moved slowly, trying to maintain a careful balance. His focus kept returning to her, noticing how she closed her eyes and softly responded to his gentle touches. After a few moments, Joan leaned back against the wall to steady herself, her body relaxing slightly. Seeing this as an opportunity, Stephen asked softly, "I know you don't want me to touch you there, but would you want to touch yourself? I'd really love to see you comfortable like that, enjoying yourself. It would be amazing to watch you." Joan, feeling a wave of emotions, barely whispered, "I don't know." Stephen, sensing her hesitation but still gently encouraging, said, "Come on, it would be beautiful to see you feel at ease." Joan's mind was spinning, caught between the tension in the room and her own need to stay grounded. She was aware of the growing intensity within her, but fought hard to maintain control over her choices, still trying to hold on to her limits despite the pull of the moment. Joan felt torn, conflicted about what she should do. She asked herself, "Is letting him watch me touch myself really cheating?" After a moment of inner struggle, she whispered, "Okay, but you promise not to do anything else, right?" Stephen, eager but trying to remain composed, reassured her, "Absolutely." He felt a rush of excitement. Before Joan could react, he gently lifted her and placed her on a desk nearby, her knees bent in front of her. His hands rested on her knees as he slowly spread them apart, his face flushing as he gazed at her with admiration. Feeling a wave of uncertainty, Joan instinctively moved her hand to cover herself, but the moment shifted when she noticed Stephen step back, maintaining his distance. Watching him, she felt a surprising sense of control and empowerment as he simply stood there, waiting. Her hesitation melted away, and she began to touch her own skin, moving with quiet confidence. Stephen watched, entranced by the sight before him, unable to speak but clearly affected. His voice trembling, he asked softly, "Can you show me more?" Joan, breathing heavily, didn't respond verbally but followed his suggestion, moving slowly. Her actions were deliberate and measured, her thoughts spinning in disbelief at how the moment had unfolded. Stephen, mesmerized by what was happening, reached out without thinking. When Joan extended her hand, he gently grasped it, holding it with reverence. His response was instinctive, drawn into the moment as he focused entirely on her. Joan's thoughts were clouded by a mix of emotions, but she remained in control, aware of the intensity between them. The moment remained charged, yet carefully restrained, as they each held on to their own sense of the moment's boundaries, respecting the fragile tension between them. Joan felt a shiver run down her spine as Stephen said softly, "You have no idea how much I want more." Her body reacted to his words, but she stayed firm, responding quickly, "No, I can't. I'm sorry." Though it wasn't what she wanted to say, she knew she had to draw a line. Stephen, taking a deep breath, replied, "That's okay." But in his mind, he wasn't ready to give up just yet. For the next few moments, the room was filled with quiet tension as they both focused on their own thoughts. Their gazes lingered on each other, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Slowly, Stephen inched closer to Joan. When he saw no sign of discomfort from her, only a fixed gaze on him, he made a subtle move, brushing his leg against hers. His touch was light but deliberate, his hand resting on her calf as he gently moved. Joan's eyes widened slightly at the sensation, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. She was caught in the moment, unable to pull away, the intensity of the situation making her pulse race. Stephen continued, tracing soft lines down her leg, his touch sending waves of uncertainty through her. As he continued to gently caress her, Stephen noticed Joan's expression shift. She seemed to lose herself in the moment, her body tense yet still. Her face softened, and her breathing deepened. Sensing the atmosphere between them shift, Stephen spoke quietly, "Don't worry, I just want to be close to you." Joan didn't respond, her mind clouded with the emotions of the moment. Stephen, seeing her hesitation but not wanting to break the fragile connection between them, carefully placed his hands on her hips, pulling her slightly forward toward the edge of the desk. The air around them remained heavy with tension, both still navigating the limits of their boundaries, yet holding back from crossing into something they couldn't undo. Stephen moved quickly, giving Joan barely any time to protest before he forcefully spread her legs apart. She let out a shocked cry, but the moment he made contact, the intensity of the situation overwhelmed her. His actions, though unexpected, left her speechless and frozen. Joan initially wanted to stop him, but the overwhelming sensations took over, and her body responded in ways she hadn't anticipated. A rush of emotions surged through her, leaving her feeling conflicted and vulnerable. She fought to regain control, but struggled as her mind and body wrestled with the moment. In a daze, Joan eventually pulled herself back, resting her weight on her elbows, her breath heavy as she tried to gather her thoughts. She looked at Stephen, her mind cloudy but beginning to clear. The tension in the room was thick, but she felt the need to regain her balance, gently placing her hand on his head to signal that it was enough. Stephen, though content with the moment, saw the change in her expression and backed away slightly. His gaze softened, and he waited for her to respond, knowing they had reached a point where they both needed to pause. Feeling the intensity subside, Joan took a deep breath, her thoughts beginning to settle. Stephen, still watching her closely, lightly traced his fingers along her arm, waiting for her to decide what would happen next. After a few moments, Stephen asked, "Are you okay with this? Should we stop?" Joan hesitated, feeling the weight of the situation. Thoughts of her husband flashed through her mind, reminding her of the reality outside of this room. She was torn between the intensity of the present and the consequences that awaited her. As Joan sat there, still feeling the lingering effects of the intense emotions she'd experienced moments before, she couldn't help but be surprised by the absence of guilt. Stephen's gentle touch on her skin seemed to enhance the sensations running through her, but she forced herself to say, Yeah, maybe we should stop. However, moments later she added quietly, I'd feel selfish if you didn't get to feel as good as I did. Stephen absorbed her words, pausing for a moment before leaning forward to place a soft kiss on her inner thigh. As he continued, he asked with a voice filled with anticipation, And how should we make that happen? Joan's body reacted to his words, but she hesitated, unsure how to answer. She guardedly replied, I don't know. I'm not sure how far I can go with this. Sensing the mix of emotions on her face, Stephen spoke gently. That's okay. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. After a brief pause, he added, But you wouldn't mind if I found a way to feel good too, right? Still intrigued by the idea, Joan whispered, No, I wouldn't mind. Stephen smiled, feeling a rush of excitement. Remember, I might not be able to hold back. Are you sure you're okay with that? Now more curious, Joan quickly responded, Yeah, I'm sure. Stephen, his voice soft yet eager, asked, Would you like to see me do that? After a moment, Joan nodded, whispering, Yeah. Can I touch you to help me? He asked, watching her closely. Joan sighed deeply as she felt Stephen's touch continue, replying softly, Yes. Anywhere? He asked, his voice low. Joan flinched slightly but gave a quiet yes. Stephen, moving carefully, leaned closer to her, still watching for any hesitation. His touch remained soft and controlled, and they both continued to navigate the delicate line between boundaries and desire, making sure to stay within a safe space where neither would feel overwhelmed. Joan gripped the sides of the desk, her body responding to Stephen's touch as she moved in rhythm with him, feeling herself getting caught up in the sensations. She tried to focus, but thoughts of guilt flickered in her mind. What are you doing, Joan? Even as the tension inside her built. Just when she felt she was nearing a breaking point, Stephen suddenly stopped, pulling his hand away. Opening her eyes, Joan's nerves surged as she felt Stephen moving closer, his actions becoming more forward. She instinctively tried to pull away, placing her hand protectively over herself and attempting to close her legs. Stephen gently held them apart, sensing her hesitation. Seeing her reaction, Stephen spoke softly, Don't worry, I won't do anything you don't want. Joan, still feeling conflicted, remained silent but couldn't stop the rush of emotions coursing through her. Stephen continued to move carefully, his touch light as he brushed against her legs, the sensations making it hard for her to think clearly. A moment later, she gasped in surprise as he playfully tapped her with his movements. The unexpected sound and sensation caused both of them to pause, aware of the intensity of the moment. For a brief time, Stephen continued teasing, but he kept things controlled. He smiled as he watched Joan's reaction, aware of the delicate balance between them. The moment was charged, but Joan's mind wandered, unable to fully separate herself from thoughts of her husband. Though her body reacted, her thoughts remained divided, pulled between the present and the weight of her decisions. As Joan continued to move slightly, her body reacting to the overwhelming sensations, her voice trembled with tension. She forced herself to say, I don't think we should continue this. We need to stop. Stephen, noticing the conflict in her words and actions, recognized the internal struggle she was facing. Instead of backing away, he decided to push the moment further. Moving closer, he placed himself near her, just enough to create a heightened sense of tension. He then asked softly, Are you sure? Are you sure you don't want more? Joan shook with uncertainty, battling between her emotions and what she knew she should do. The intensity of the situation was making it hard for her to respond. Stephen, sensing her hesitation, gently teased her again, staying close, speaking softly. Look at how close we are. Are you sure you don't want to keep going, even just for a little bit? Joan's mind was spinning as the moment continued to escalate, and though her body responded in a way that made it difficult to think, she managed to whisper, I don't know. I don't think this is right. At that point, Stephen's self-control was stretched thin. He was aware of the boundaries but caught in the intensity of the moment. He knew the consequences but felt too overwhelmed to pull back. Still, he hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Before Joan could fully react, the moment reached its breaking point, and everything she had been struggling with hit her at once. The intensity of the emotions was overwhelming, and though the moment had crossed a line, she was left speechless, caught between the rush of emotions and the weight of the choices that had been made. Joan's mind was racing, and her body responded in ways she didn't expect. Ever since she had entered the strip club earlier that evening, she felt a growing sense of temptation. Now, with Stephen close, the intensity of the situation hit her. She knew her husband was nearby, unaware of what was happening, and that knowledge only added to the tension she was feeling. Just a few moments were all it took for her emotions to overwhelm her, and she was swept away by the sensation. Stephen held on to her tightly, completely focused on her. He could see how deeply Joan was caught up in the moment, her body reacting to everything with such intensity. He admired the way she lost herself in the experience, her reactions clear on her face, and he felt drawn in even further. The atmosphere was charged, and they were both moving without thinking, lost in the whirlwind of emotions. As they continued, Stephen adjusted his grip, holding her firmly, his actions deliberate but steady. He could see how much Joan was affected by everything, and he responded to the signals she gave. Her focus on him only made the moment feel more intense, but throughout it all, a sense of awareness lingered between them, a shared understanding of how far things had gone. Joan's thoughts were divided, though. She locked eyes with Stephen, feeling the intensity, but her mind flickered back to the reality of what was happening. She was doing something she knew she shouldn't, and yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt. The situation felt wrong, yet part of her was captivated by the excitement, even if she couldn't fully understand why. It was an intense moment that both of them knew would have lasting consequences. Joan had always been raised to be a devoted Catholic and a loving wife. Despite her strong values, there was a part of her, hidden deep inside, that she had always managed to keep in check until now. As these thoughts ran through her mind, she watched Stephen closely. Her curiosity piqued when he unexpectedly pulled her leg closer and gently kissed her toes. The sensation surprised her, but to her surprise, she found herself enjoying the moment. As Stephen continued, Joan instinctively reached down to her lower abdomen, feeling a strange mix of emotions as she allowed herself to experience the moment fully. The feelings overwhelmed her, and soon her body responded in ways she had never anticipated. She gasped deeply, her back arching in response to the intensity of it all, as she felt herself losing control for a moment. Stephen, watching Joan's reaction, worked hard to maintain his composure. The sight of her losing herself in the moment nearly overwhelmed him too, but he managed to hold back. He placed his hands on her hips to steady her and leaned in closer, his voice filled with excitement as he reassured her, "You're incredible right now." As they both navigated the intensity of the situation, Stephen tried to keep himself grounded, but his voice trembled with emotion as he spoke softly, aware of how deeply they had both gone. His words, though meant to comfort, also carried the weight of the choices they had made, and Joan could feel the emotions behind them. Joan, still overwhelmed, couldn't respond as her mind tried to process everything happening. The moment was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and the rush of emotions left her momentarily speechless, caught between the intensity of the present and the realization of the path they had taken together. After the intensity of the moment started to fade, Joan suddenly felt a strong urge to shift her focus to Stephen. Knowing that continuing might cause discomfort later, she decided to guide the situation differently. She reached up and gently touched his chest, hoping to create a new connection, and said breathlessly, "You've been amazing. No one has ever made me feel like this." After a pause, she added, "Now, I really want to do something for you." Stephen, encouraged by her words, let out a quiet moan as he continued to move rhythmically. "Are you sure?" he asked, still full of energy. "You've got me worked up and I'm not sure I can hold back." Joan smiled, flattered by his response, and replied, "Yes, I want to make this just as good for you as it has been for me." Stephen thought for a moment, then said, "Okay, but there's one more thing I'd like to do." Without further explanation, Stephen gently lifted Joan, helping her off the desk with care. He held her close as he carried her to the nearby bed, and she wrapped her arms around him for support. He placed her softly on the bed, motioning for her to move to the center. Joan, feeling curious and slightly anxious, followed his lead, unsure of what was coming next. As Stephen moved toward her, his actions were deliberate. Without saying a word, he gently repositioned her, and Joan's heart raced with uncertainty. He guided her carefully, placing her in a comfortable position on her hands and knees. Though she was surprised by the shift, Joan focused on trusting the moment, letting her breath slow as she adjusted to the new feeling of vulnerability. As Joan felt Stephen's hands firmly gripping her hips, she suddenly felt more vulnerable than she had all night. She gasped when he adjusted his position, and she could feel him lowering his head. The unexpected sensation of his touch made her tense up slightly, but she was caught off guard by the unfamiliar feeling. It was a sensation she had never experienced before, and it left her breathless. The intensity of the moment made her movements instinctive as she adjusted her body in response, overwhelmed by a new wave of emotions. She couldn't believe how quickly her body responded, lost in the newness of it all. Stephen, noticing her reaction, moved with care, adjusting himself as the atmosphere shifted. He paused for a moment, taking in the energy of the room before continuing. They were both caught up in the rush of the moment, unsure of what would come next, but fully immersed in it nonetheless. A few moments later, Stephen, feeling the shift in Joan's body, pulled back gently. He looked at her, admiring the connection they had shared, before repositioning himself beside her. Both were now more attuned to each other's presence, the intensity of the moment slowly giving way to a sense of calm. Joan, catching her breath, still felt the lingering effects of everything that had just unfolded. She knew they had crossed a boundary and that there would be no going back from what had happened. But for now, she let herself rest in the quiet aftermath, reflecting on how things had changed between them in such a short time. Joan, still caught in the moment, watched Stephen closely as he reacted to her words. His body tensed, and she could see he was on the edge. With a final surge of energy, Stephen reached his peak, his expression showing the intensity of the moment. Joan gasped, surprised by how captivated she was by everything unfolding in front of her. She remained focused, observing with a mixture of emotions. The experience left her feeling breathless, overwhelmed by how things had quickly escalated between them. When Stephen finally calmed, he looked down at her, clearly still caught in the emotions of the moment. He asked softly, "Can I kiss you?" Without hesitation, Joan reached up and pulled him closer. Their kiss was warm and full of the energy they had just shared, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had experienced. They both lingered in the moment, their thoughts intertwined with the complexity of what had happened. As Stephen held her, Joan found herself wanting more, but this time in a more tender, reflective way. She whispered softly, "Stay with me a little longer." Stephen, responding to her request, gently held her close, and they both stayed in the quiet after the storm, allowing themselves a moment of calm. Unbeknownst to Joan and Stephen, a small hidden camera had been recording everything. Far away in a dark room, someone watched the footage on a large screen. Brent sat there, gripping the armrests of his chair, his face tense as he observed the events unfolding before him. His eyes were glued to the screen, his emotions a mix of disbelief, anger, and something he couldn't fully understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away, no matter how much he wanted to. The reality of what he was watching had shaken him to his core, and it left him in a state of confusion, unable to process what he had just witnessed. In a brief moment, he glanced away from the sight of his wife being intimate with another man to look into Stacy's eyes as she took in what he offered. Enjoying the moment, he said, "That was the best experience I've ever had." Stacy smiled at the compliment, and he felt a mix of surprise and pleasure as she continued to show appreciation. She then moved to sit on his lap, watching her husband with Brent's wife. Turning to him, she asked, "So, how do you really feel watching your wife with someone else?" As Brent stayed focused on the screen, he quickly replied, "It's the most exciting thing I've ever seen. I've thought about this for a long time, I'm not sure why, but seeing it now is really intense. I hope you let me make it up to you someday." With a smile, Stacy replied, "I'll hold you to that." After watching their spouses for a few minutes, Brent eventually asked, "How about you? Do you ever feel bad or jealous when Stephen is with other women?" "No. I know he's enjoying himself and he will come home with me tonight for some fun. Not just tonight, but for the next few weeks." After a while, Stacy curiously asked, "So tell me, Has your wife ever mentioned anything about wanting to explore with another woman? Feeling his interest rise from her question, Brent answered, No, but after tonight I wouldn't be surprised. Why do you ask? Brent, your wife is really attractive. I would love to experience that too. Grinning, Brent replied, Maybe we should see if we can make that happen. We're here for 2 more nights. Stacy smiled and felt his renewed excitement against her. As she playfully engaged with him, she said, Yes, let's try to arrange that. I would really enjoy that. However, she then added, But for now, I want to focus on you first. Is that okay? You won't hear any objections from me. Then both continued to enjoy the sight of their spouses together. That's the end of part 1. But the story is far from over. Joan's choices are about to lead to even more shocking consequences. You won't want to miss what comes next in this thrilling journey of temptation and betrayal. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're the first to catch part 2, premiering in just a few hours.